Hello everyone, my name is Keri Ramirez. I am the Managing Director of Studymove, and it's great to see you once again. Thank you for joining this our third key data update of 2024. Today we're going to have a very interesting session. We're going to share with you the main findings of our 2024 comparative analysis of international tuition fees in Australia. As you know, pricing is such an important part of the marketing mix. It's one of the most important factors when you are engaging with international applicants, because it really helps you just to provide part of the value proposition that you are putting in the market. And for that reason, we thought it would be very interesting just to look at this data set. We're gonna share with you a couple of very valuable insights, the big story in regards to fees in 2024. But before I do that, I think it's important just to remember that setting fees in our sector is something that is quite complex and sometimes even challenging for universities in particular. The idea of selling fees, of course, has the rationality of do something or setting the right pricing that will help institutions to reach their financial goals. But on that, of course, this has to be balanced with market conditions and how universities will actually engage with international applicants. And in this year in particular, it seems that it has been that balancing game what universities had followed just to establish their 2024 fees. And we're going to share some very interesting insights with you in just 1 minute. But also, I think it's important to acknowledge that one of the difficulties that we have in our sector is that on a yearly basis, universities, they need to find the correct pricing position that helps them to engage not only with one market, but with multiple markets. We are in a business that basically need to get it right, not only for one specific audience, but basically the same audience in very different countries. And on top of that, of course, the pricing position of universities is affected by changes on exchange rates. So this makes the analysis and the assessment quite complex. And for that reason, we always try just to provide something for the sector that helps to understand how the sector can actually move forward and to provide some understanding on how, in general, the universities are reacting year by year. Finally, the last thing that makes this complex, and probably that's one of many, is that different to other sectors, institutions, in particular universities, they don't set prices for just one or a handful set of products. Universities, they have sometimes hundreds of programs, and it's important just to find that right level that coordinates the complete marketing approach, and once again helps the institution just to achieve their financial goals. So there's a lot behind it, and I always commend on everybody behind this analysis. And the reason, once again, what we are doing this is just to assist you and your institution just to have a complementary insight of what's happening in the market. And today, the main topic is exactly that. What is the main story of 2024 in regards to pricing? And we at Studymove, we have been looking at pricing for many years now. This is, I think, our 8th year that we have been looking at pricing. We collect data for every single program offered to international students across all the university sector. We do this not only for Australia, we also do it for New Zealand, and we also do it for other sectors like the ELICAS, the VET, and the New HEPS market in different projects that we actually participate every year. But today I'm just gonna focus on the results across the university sector. And in order to do that, I'm just gonna share with you the highlights of our three main fee data reports that Studymove produce every year. And once again, I just want to say thank you to all the universities who have been supporting our work in this area. We had a very positive response from you, and we really appreciate that. And this really helps us just to continue providing an analysis that helps your institution, your teams, and the sector. So as you can see on the screen, we actually are going to use data from 3 different data sets. Sometimes universities, they look at our complete set of data. Some others, they look just to our comparative analysis, which is a summary of the information that is related to fees. It gives you information about the average annual international fee across all universities to different study levels and 11 discipline areas. And we're also going to look at the result of this relationship that exists between rankings and fees. Now, these 3 datasets of fees, of course, there are like 3 main parts of a big puzzle in terms of how we can understand pricing strategies across the sector. But the fourth one that is extremely important to complement the analysis with is, of course, the scholarships that are available for international students, in particular, new international students. So I'm also going to take some of the analysis of this particular report just to complement and to provide you the big picture on how universities are pricing themselves in 2024. Okay. All right. So it's going to take about 30 minutes this session, and I'm just going to talk first about what has been the overall changes in terms on how universities as a whole have been moving forward in terms of how they actually have been correcting or adjusting their different prices strategies. From moving from a whole, I'm also going to give you what different universities are doing, what's a different position that exists, and how this position is relevant to look at, because in many ways that really affects the whole marketing mix that universities put forward to engage with international applicants. And as I said, we're going to look at the factors that are affecting pricing strategies. We're going to talk about how scholarships will be affecting your pricing strategies, the role of rankings. And just briefly, I'm just going to talk about some changes that we have seen in some specific discipline areas that I think it's just useful just to provide you and to share that insight with all of you. Okay. All right. Okay. So, what's the main story that we identify through the data in regards to the use of international fees or the position that universities are taking in 2024? Now, before I really jump into the numbers, I think it's very important just to put some context into the results that you're going to see today. The main one, and probably the most important one, is that we need to remember that fees are actually set in advance. So, for example, the 2024 fees are usually set at the start of 2023 or maybe at mid 2023. It varies across universities, but overall, that's the timeline where we have seen when universities actually make this assessment, discuss, and set their fees for the following year. Now, this is important because a lot of things have changed in just a few months. And on the time that the fees were actually set back in 2023, we were actually in the midst of the rapid recovery that it was experienced by the sector. So there were very positive market conditions. A lot of universities were reporting high number of international applicants and applications, of course. So it's of course understandable that universities, they could foresee that these positive market conditions will continue and higher demand for international education programs will continue. So that's one of the big factors that I think was the mindset that the sector had at the time that 2024 fees were actually set. But at the same time, universities were actually facing with some financial constraints and a lot of pressure that came from the highest level of inflation that we had in Australia. As you probably remember, last year the inflation was about 6 or 7%. It was extremely high, and that was putting additional pressure in the negotiation of wages and costing across the university sector. So I think those are the main factors that they were playing, and you will see how universities react based on those assumptions and that mindset that it was created back in 2023. So I think the best chart that explains these changes, and in fact it tells the story on pricing quite well, is when we actually see across all the universities on average what has been the increment that we have seen in the last few years. So starting in 2018, 19, and 20, this is pretty much before the pandemic, we saw that universities, they were increasing their fees around 5%. Then during the pandemic, due to the challenges that everybody faced during this period, the majority of universities did not increase their fees, and the ones who increased fees, it was a very small increment. So it was about 1.75 the increase in that particular year. Now, in 2023, the increment in fees that it was reported, it had like a kind of like a mixed group of universities, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. Some universities, they felt that we were out of the pandemic challenges, so they adjust their fees quite significant, but not everybody followed that path. But this year, with completely different set of conditions, with what it was expected higher demand for higher education programs, and to compensate and to resolve probably some of the financial constraints, that's when we actually saw an increase of 5.1 on average across the university sector, which, as you can see, is the very first time since the pandemic that we reach that level of increment in fees. Now, what I think is interesting is not to look only at the average number, but really give you the complete range of increments in the sector. And before I show you how it was the increment on 2024, I just want to show you also what was the increment that we saw last year, because it's actually quite interesting just to see how much things have changed. So when universities were actually setting in their fees for 2023, what we saw is that it was a mixed set of responses. We still have some universities that decide not to do that. And once again, this is going back last year. We have 20 who actually increased their fees between 2 and 4%, and 14 that increased more than 4%. Now, for this year, you're going to see how much it changes. And the massive change is on the green bar, the number of universities who actually have higher increases on their fees for 2024. So as you can see here, basically only one university maintained their fees for this year, less than 1% increment. Then we have 13 universities between 1 and 4%, and the vast majority, 26 universities, increase their fees in more than 4%. And as you can see, there's actually quite a significant group that went beyond that number, when increasing their fees more than 6%. So this actually makes obvious that basically what everybody was expecting is that market conditions will be quite favorable, and in fact, it was a really good opportunity just to really deal with these financial constraints that universities have been facing for so many years now. Unfortunately, nobody was expecting that it will be the changes in the migration policies that everybody's deal with it now. And although it's expected that the bulk of the numbers for the higher education sector will be affected in the second half of the year, it shows how important it is especially for policymakers to understand that it takes time for especially the higher education sector, the university sector, to really readjust to changes in conditions and changes in policies. So different to other sectors like, for example, airlines that could easily change their pricing position. They actually change it sometimes by the minute, or hotels or resorts that probably they change in a daily basis. For the education sector, in particular the university sector, is something that is quite static, and I think it's important just to have a consideration upon that. But basically, this is the result that we had in 2024 with a completely different mindset and definitely higher growth in fees in comparison to what we saw in the last year. Now, just I would like just to share the complete timeline on how average annual international student fees in Australia have changed since 2018 all the way to 2024. This is for a master's by courseworks, that's the blue line, and then in the orange you see undergraduate programs. And as you can see, it has been obviously grow. It is something that is quite natural. I think everybody expects that. But what I think this chart shows is that apart from the gap that has always been reported between postgrad and undergrad, that's an interesting result itself, just to see that it's usually about $1,000 the difference between one or the other. In fact, in 2024, we had a little bit of a higher gap. And this is because we identified, or the market, or we have seen higher growth and higher demand for postgraduate programs. So it's not surprised that the gap is slightly bigger. But what I think is also interesting is that this chart also tells us the story and potentially help us just to understand what it might be the trend that it will continue in the next following years. So pre-pandemic, the growth on average across all sectors, across all universities, it was 5%. Then during the pandemic, a slowdown of about 2%, and then we are about 4%, considering that in 2023, some universities, they were still unsure about how the market will react. Now, the big question that, of course, probably you are asking at the moment is how we're going to move forward depending on or as a result of the changes in the migration policy. I think it's a little bit early to say, and it really depends on how much things will change in the next couple of months. But so far, this is a trend, and I think it's very useful just to have an indication on how, on average, things have been growing historically. Now, what I want to show you now is going back to the results of 2024, looking at this average of nearly $38,000, and looking only at the undergraduate results. We provide in our reports postgraduate, undergraduate, and study abroad for 11 discipline areas. But this actually helps us just to understand how universities are actually positioning themselves and how they're actually connecting their value proposition they're putting in the market based on their pricing positioning. The first thing that I want to explain is that every blue dot that you see here represents the 2024 annual average international fee for undergraduate programs. So, we have some universities that actually have, above 50,000, some others that are below 25,000. And that's one of the very first things that when we present this chart about 7 years ago, people actually were, in a way, not everybody, but some people were critical against this wide range of different pricing points that we have here in Australia. It's quite a unique thing, but what basically some critics were saying is that it's hard to believe that in the same university sector, an international student could pay for potentially the same degree $25,000 or more than $50,000, basically double. So the range of pricing points is actually quite wide. But in fact, I truly believe that this has been one of the benefits of the education sector in Australia, because it's allowing the Australian international education sector to connect with very different audiences. And this is when the pricing data is just fascinating to look at, because it really helps us just to understand the structure and the nature of the sector. Uh, Definitely a student that basically is on the 50,000 range, it will be very different to a student that is on the 25,000 range. And the fact that we can connect with multiple audiences, it also enriches the diversity that we can have here in the sector. Now, what I think is also interesting is just to look into more detail at this particular chart. As you can see, we have two universities that this GIAD report a fee that is above $50,000. Then we have a second group that you will see here. It's about 9 universities that is between 40 and 50,000. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that there is a large group of universities that they had a very narrow price differentiation point, which is about $6,000 between these two particular metrics. And this particular narrow differentiation point that exists from a pricing point of view, of course, it leads for this group of universities to invest more in explaining to international applicants what are the differentiation points that exist between different competitors. These are the group of universities that I believe invest a lot in explaining to international applicants what is the difference in employability that they have, or the program structure, or the benefits, or the location, because from a price range, there is not a lot of differences. And this compact group is something that we have seen also in other countries. And I know that that actually represents a challenge because, as I said, from a pricing point of view, international applicants, they don't see a big difference, which they need additional aspects just to make the decisions and to try to understand what are the benefits or what else somebody else can offer me when I'm seeking an international experience at certain universities. So I think this chart also is very helpful in that aspect, just to explain those differences and some natural challenges that some universities are facing. All right, so that's the general story that we get from 2024. But I think it's also interesting just to highlight that through the process of collecting the data, we have identified some changes at the level of discipline areas. And some discipline areas, for example, and this is looking not only at 2024, but also we identified that in 2023. So I'm making this a group or categories of discipline areas based on not only 24, but also 2023. Some actually align quite closely to how, in general, basically the increments in fees is actually reported. So, for example, programs in the areas of management and commerce, which is basically business, the same for creative arts and architecture and building, we noticed in the last 2 years that they align closely to how, in general, the institutions are actually adjusting their price. So, for example, if a university increase their fees by 5% in average, most of the time, these discipline areas, they follow that particular trend. Now, what I think is interesting is to look at the ones who not necessarily align to this. And the first one that clearly is not aligning is education. For some reason, education programs usually have lower increments to the average. It's just probably the nature of the program or some of the structural aspects on the demand for education programs. So usually those ones, they not necessarily align. And I think it's an interesting insight just to have for your future reference. But also one that is going to be interesting to follow is the ones who are actually have increments above the average of each institution, which is engineering and information technology. These two in particular, we notice that they actually have increased, the increase in fees has been higher than the average or to the rest of the programs. And I have the impression that this, especially in the last 2 years, is the result of seeing higher demand for these particular programs, which we know we had experienced higher demand from the subcontinent, where we know that there is higher demand for these particular programs. Now, I'm highlighting this in particular because due to the change in the migration policies, maybe we need to make additional considerations next year. And maybe we need to understand that if there has been an impact in the number of students, maybe we need to really adjust it and to not think that this demand will continue. And now it's a bit early, but I think it's just important just to have additional considerations when you are making your analysis and you are thinking about your future setting of pricing for the next couple of years. Okay. All right. So we talk a lot about the general perspective of pricing, and I probably went through a lot of charts, but the general idea is that we are actually experiencing growth of 5.1% this year. We had different universities playing in different positions. We have correction done or adjustment done by different discipline areas. But something that I know has been on their mindset of universities is to understand the role of these two factors as well. And we have been putting a lot of time to look into these ones. The first one is the role of scholarships, and I'm going to share with you some insights of the report that we have produced this year, and also their results on how the rankings are still affecting or not pricing position. The first one, I think it's quite interesting. Scholarships have been evolving, and the way in which universities have been engaging through scholarship have been changing, I think, quite significantly in the last couple of years. So it's important just to go back in time and to understand how we have seen these changes and what is the current position from a scholarship point of view to complement pricing strategies. What we identified this year is that Australian universities are still engaging in the use of scholarships, but not as much as we have seen in the past. The chart that you see here is basically the number of scholarship programs that we have identified that are available to new international students. So, of course, these are not the total number of scholarships available. What you see on the screen is each university, how many scholarship programs they have to offer, which gives us an indication of basically how active are we actually engaging in this particular area. And as you can see, it has been actually decreasing since 2021, when we actually had the peak on the particular number of scholarships offered to international students. Actually, this is new international students. It's also important just to see that it has been not only a reduction in the number of scholarship programs, but we have seen that, and this is when it's important to look at the detail of scholarships. We have seen that we are moving from a widely use of scholarships, and this actually happened quite a bit during the pandemic, when a lot of universities, because of the challenges of COVID, they actually had to put a lot of fee waivers that could actually benefit all international students. We're moving for that kind of like wide perspective of using scholarships to something definitely more targeted. One of the things that we identified, first of all, is that unlimited number of scholarships are reducing significantly. From last year, where we actually saw quite a bit of that happening, we identified this year that universities are establishing the number of scholarships available. So from unlimited, a lot of them are actually going to, let's say, 200 or 100 scholarships available. So we're moving from using the scholarships as the main aspect of the pricing strategies to something that really just complements certain parts of your pricing strategies. And that also has been obvious because a lot of the scholarships are not open to students from all around the world, but instead to particular countries. And I'm just going to give you more insights of that in just 1 minute. Now, I think that this big shift from widely using scholarships to a more targeted way is also important because I have heard that in the sector there is this idea of a net pricing, which is basically this is my price, but because I discounted it, you need to understand what's the net price that I have. I think that that rationality was correct during COVID when we had this wide perspective of scholarships. But now that it's targeted and limited, it's completely different. I think we need to be very careful with the use of that definition nowadays, because what definitely we have seen now is that universities are more conscious and strategic in the way in which they're using their scholarships. Now, the other thing that is interesting before I go to the countries is the type of scholarships that we have for this year. So as I said, the total number of scholarship programs has been decreasing in the last couple of years. They are now limited, but the way in which universities are packaging scholarships is a little bit different. We saw this shift starting last year, but this year is very clear that merit scholarships is how universities are putting together these scholarship programs. Only 7% of the programs that we identify are fee waivers, which back in the pandemic, it was very common. A lot of universities basically said, look, it's a discount because we understand the challenges. And in many ways, that was the right thing to do. Now we are moving into the merit-based scholarships. In fact, 36 out of 40 universities, they offer merit-based scholarships in comparison to 23 out of 40 who have equity scholarships and 12 out of 40. Last year, we had, I'm pretty sure it was 16 out of 40 that there were fee waivers. So now we have 4 less that are only using fee waivers. So they're still around, but not as much as we have seen in the past. All right. And as I said, we also noticed that universities are moving away from those scholarships that are available to all students, and instead they're actually using scholarships, or not using, they're actually bringing scholarships to support their pricing strategies in markets where it seems that it's important just to complement their international student recruitment strategies and pricing strategies with the use of scholarships. As you can see, these are the top markets with country-specific scholarships. India in particular is one that we have seen has grown significantly. Last year, we had 21 universities who have India-specific scholarships. The year before, it was 18, so it has been steadily growing. Indonesia also had 5 universities more. For 20, it grew to 25. Vietnam are the same for 20 to 25. Sri Lanka 6, and Malaysia 7 more. So it's an interesting shift, and I hope that this helped you and your teams just to assess how you could actually use the scholarships to complement your pricing strategies. But I really think that the topic of scholarships is starting to be more in the detail in how many I'm going to be offering, to which students, what are the merits that we are looking for scholarships, to award scholarships. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how we're going to shift the mindset in the use of scholarships to something that is a little bit more targeted rather than, as I said, the wide approach that we had previously. And that is just what we can read through the data. I'm sure that you will be able just to have a more comprehensive look of the data sets when you actually look at them in detail. All right, so that's the big picture about scholarships. And I also just want to talk about rankings. As we know, rankings have been playing a very important factor in how universities are actually aligning their pricing position. There are many analysts that have been looked at this, is how international applicants perceive quality. There is a lot of factors that may play into this, but the reality is that once again in 2024, and this is the chart for this year, this is for undergraduate programs, but we have one for postgraduate programs, they still, as you can see, there is a clear alignment of universities with higher ranking are settling higher fees. And somebody was asking me, why universities are doing that? Well, it seems that the market is actually reacting to this rationality as well. Universities are doing it because international applicants, they think that that's how it should be. So that's interesting correlation that exists between these two particular factors. What I think has been also quite interesting is that, in particular, 3 or 4 universities who have done really well in the QS rankings these years are the ones who definitely are taking that opportunity just to adjust their fees a lot more. I think that those big jumps in rankings, that's what I think leads to universities to think, okay, if it was a big improvement, I could actually adjust a little bit more than what I was expecting. So yeah, I think sometimes those big jumps go in the way in which universities are assessing these changes as well. But I have to say, and we look at QS rankings and we look at Times Higher Education rankings, and something that we have done for many years is not only look at the overall rankings, but also look at what is called the subject rankings. So as you know, Times Higher Education and QEOS also provide subject rankings, and we're trying to see if there is a correlation or not with at that particular level. The reality is that for many disciplines, there's still a very strong correlation, and you can see those with very strong correlation, not all of them, but the majority. I'm just sharing the ones that I think are interesting. But as you can see, economics, accounting, computer science, engineering, all those who are part of the higher demand for international students, they still had that strong correlation with the way in which pricing plays across the Australian university sector. But it's important just to understand that there are some exceptions to all this. The ones that actually probably the main ones that we had for this year, this is against the QS subject rankings, is nursing that we have seen in this area for many years. Nursing, it seems that universities are not really aligning to rankings because they understand that international applicants probably don't react for nursing. They don't react that much to a ranking. What they want is that professional qualification. And the other one, which is interesting, is architecture and building an environment. In the past, we also identified that education plays in this particular arena where rankings don't play that much. But this year, architecture and building an environment are also part of these disciplines with moderate or weak correlation. So what I just want to highlight is that when you do your analysis, I think it's important not only to look at the overall rankings, but also look at a subject and a discipline level, what's happening, so you can actually adjust accordingly. All right, so finally, I just want to share with you some views about what we have seen in terms of 2024 international fees. I think that the big story is that universities, they realize the opportunity to adjust their fees, their fees to the levels that we have seen before the pandemic, due to, as I said, better market conditions, but also the effects of inflation. And this is important because in the same way that the assessment was done, that market conditions were positive, I think it's going to be very important that we have enough information, and this is from policymakers, just to understand what are going to be basically the circumstances that we're going to have to deal with when we actually move forward for next year. Also, it's interesting just to see the scholarships are still relevant, but the way in which universities have been engaging in this particular area is changing, definitely. Once again, from this wider approach that we had in the past to a more target and strategic use of scholarships. So that's the other big result that we identify this year. And what we can get or expect ahead, and I'm getting a lot of questions at the moment about this, is still uncertain. And I hope that policymakers understand that different to other sectors, and even in the service sector, An airline can actually adjust their fees by the hour. Actually, sometimes they adjust their fees by minutes. Hotels also change or adjust their fees on a daily basis. For universities, that the process of settling things is so complex and is done on a daily basis, it's extremely important and valuable just to get all the information about what it could happen next year so they can actually make the right decisions. Of course, we will provide you with the data that hopefully will help you in the assessment, but I think that it's important just to have that consideration. And in regards to policy, which I wouldn't say it's unfortunately, but yeah, it has been the main topic for the sector. Also, I think that this set of data shows the level of distortion that something like capping the number of international students will create in the market. I think that a demand-driven model, the one that we had since forever, has been able just to allow universities just to connect with the right audience. It's allowed universities just to showcase the value proposition and provide the right experience for its students. But if suddenly we get cap numbers, I think that that's going to create a lot of distortions. Think about a university that suddenly the number of students, it gets capped in half. Well, probably the way to compensate financially is that they're going to have to increase their fees. And that's not related to market conditions. It's just a way to react to a policy that is creating distortions in the market. And I think we need to be fully aware of that level of disruption that it could create in a model that has been quite effective for many years. Hopefully, we will not have to go into that road, but I think it's important consideration to make. And on that note, I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining this session. If you have any question, my email is there. And if you want to learn more about our different projects or reports, please contact us. We're more than happy just to help you. On that, thank you again for your time. Thank you again for the opportunity to connect once again. And I hope you enjoyed this session. And we'll send you the recorded version and the slides very soon. Okay? All right. Take care, everybody. See ya. Have a good one. Bye.